The gods of chaos, powers beyond comprehension. Before the universe had its current shape, before the first star ignited or the first world cooled from the fire of creation, the warp existed. It has always existed, the immaterial mirror of the material universe, a dimension of pure psychic energy in which the emotions and thoughts and dreams and nightmares of every living mind leave their mark. The warp is not evil. It is not good. It is a reflection, and like all reflections, it shows you what is there to be shown. And what is there has never been reassuring. For most of the universe's history, the warp was turbulent but navigable, a dimension of swirling psychic currents that could be exploited for faster-than-light travel and that produced entities of varying power and disposition, but nothing of organized malevolence at the highest scales. That changed. It changed because life spread across the galaxy, and with life came mind, and with mind came the full spectrum of what minds produce. Ambition and envy and despair and the particular ecstasy that violence and excess provide to those who pursue them without restraint. These things accumulated in the warp, the way heat accumulates in a sealed space, and eventually the accumulation crossed a threshold. And out of the churning sea of psychic energy, 4 entities condensed, each one the living embodiment of an aspect of mortal experience taken to its absolute extreme. They are the Chaos Gods. They are Khorne and Tzeentch and Nurgle and Slaanesh. They are older than the Imperium of Man, older than the Eldar Empire whose fall birthed the youngest of them, older than most of the civilizations that have risen and fallen in this galaxy across its long history. They are not gods in the sense that the Imperium's official theology uses the word, not beings who created the universe or who exist outside it in benevolent supervision. They are beings who grew from the universe, who are made of it, who are fed by it, and in turn feed upon it in a cycle that has no natural endpoint. Understanding them requires setting aside the frameworks that most religious traditions use to think about divine power. They do not want worship in the way that theology describes. They want what feeds them, which is the emotional states and behaviors they embody, and worship is simply one mechanism by which mortals provide what they want. They are not evil in a way that evil can be opposed by good. They are fundamental aspects of psychic reality given autonomous existence, and their opposition to order and civilization is not ideological. It is ecological. Order starves them, chaos feeds them, everything else follows from this. The warp, the ocean of souls. To understand the Chaos Gods, you must first understand the medium they live in, because they are not simply powerful beings who happen to reside in the warp. They are expressions of the warp's nature, the points at which its diffuse energies have concentrated into something that persists and acts with intention. The warp, also called the Materium or the Sea of Souls, is the psychic dimension that underlies and interpenetrates the material universe. Every mind in the material universe has a presence in the warp, a psychic shadow that persists as long as the mind that casts it continues to exist. The collective psychic output of billions of thinking beings across the galaxy creates an ongoing turbulence in the warp, currents and eddies and storms of psychic energy that move through the Materium according to rules that are more emotional than physical. When living beings experience strong emotions, especially collectively and over long periods, those emotions leave concentrated deposits in the warp. Fear becomes something in the warp. Rage becomes something. The particular combination of sensation-seeking and cruelty that characterized the Eldar Empire at its height became something, and that something eventually became Slaanesh. This is not metaphorical. It is the literal mechanism by which the Chaos Gods came into existence and by which they are sustained. The warp is also where daemons live, where the souls of the dead pass through on their way to whatever comes next, and where the psychic power that psychers draw on originates. It is the dimension that the Chaos Gods rule, which gives them power over travel, communication, and the psychic arts that no material force can match in kind. The Emperor built the Astronomicon and the Webway project specifically to give humanity tools for navigating and eventually escaping the warp's dangers. And the partial failure of that project, the Webway breach that the Thousand Suns sorcery caused at the moment of Horus's rebellion, is one of the reasons the current age of the setting is so cosmically precarious. The four Chaos Gods do not share the warp equally or peaceably. They are in constant competition with each other, a competition called the Great Game that has been ongoing since they first became distinct entities. Territory in the warp shifts constantly as the gods' relative power waxes and wanes with the fortunes of their mortal followers. Alliances form and break. Demonic armies clash in battles that have no permanent resolution. The Great Game is one of the few things that prevents the Chaos Gods from focusing their full power on the material universe. And the Imperium and other civilizations have survived, partly because the gods are as interested in competing with each other as they are in consuming everything outside the warp. Khorne, the Blood God. Khorne is the oldest of the four Chaos Gods, the first to achieve the critical mass of psychic energy necessary to condense from the warp's turbulence into a distinct and persistent entity. He is the god of war, of violence, of honor in battle, of slaughter without distinction, of the specific psychic state that combat produces in the minds of those engaged in it. He is rage and martial pride, and the particular exaltation that killing produces in beings who have been shaped by evolution to treat survival at the cost of others as a virtue. He is depicted as a massive figure, seated upon a throne of skulls, armored in black and brass, with the head of a hound and a body that suggests that even the concept of flesh has been refined down to its most aggressive possible expression. His symbol, the skull rune, appears wherever his followers fight, carved into armor and tattooed on skin and left as a mark on the bodies of enemies. His sacred colors are red and brass. His sacred number is 8. Khorne embodies a contradiction that his followers spend considerable effort avoiding examining too closely. He is the god of martial honor as much as he is the god of slaughter, and in his most coherent theological expression, he demands that his warriors face worthy opponents, that they fight with their own hands rather than through sorcery or guile, and that the blood and skulls they offer him come from enemies who deserve the fight. He despises Tzeentch above all the other gods precisely because Tzeentch represents magic and scheming, the antithesis of direct martial engagement. He is contemptuous of Nurgle's passive acceptance and Slaaanesh's decadent excess. In practice, this theological coherence breaks down quickly because Khorne does not actually discriminate between blood spilled in honorable combat and blood spilled in massacre. His actual demand is simpler than his theology suggests. Blood must flow, skulls must be taken, and the psychic energy of violence must feed the warp, and therefore feed him. The honor framing is genuine but secondary, a preference rather than a requirement. What he requires is the killing. Everything else is aesthetics. His followers in the mortal world are warriors who have given themselves to the state of perpetual combat that Khorne represents. The Khornate berserkers of the World Eater's Traitor Legion are the most famous, warriors whose minds have been altered by surgical modification and prolonged exposure to Khorne's psychic influence, to the point where the battle fury is not merely a choice but a compulsion. The Butcher's Nails, the cortical implants that the World Eater's Primarch Angron had installed in his warriors and eventually in himself, are the physical mechanism by which this compulsion was enforced. Neurological modifications that stimulate the brain's aggression centers continuously while blocking access to the neural pathways associated with satisfaction and calm. A World Eater's berserker is never not in combat state. The nails fire constantly, and the only relief available is the act of killing, which provides a momentary reduction in the neurological pressure before the nails reassert themselves. They fight because fighting is the only way to reduce the pain of not fighting. Angron himself is one of the most tragic figures in the Horus heresy narrative, a Primarch who was already broken before the Emperor found him. who had been subjected to the butcher's nails by the slave masters of the world he fell on, who had led a slave rebellion of gladiators that the Emperor interrupted at the moment of its climactic final battle. The Emperor teleported Angron away from that battle, saving his life, but abandoning the human warriors who had followed him to their deaths. Angron never forgave this. He joined the heresy not out of ideological conviction, but out of rage at a father who had once failed to let him die with his people. And his eventual elevation to Daemon Prince of Khorne was not an ascension he sought, but a transformation that the accumulated rage of the Nails and 10,000 years of war made inevitable. Bloodblusters are Khorne's greatest daemons, entities of such concentrated martial power that their presence on a battlefield shifts the engagement toward a kind of pure violence that other tactical considerations cannot easily account for. They are enormous, winged, armed with the axe of Khorne and the lash of Khorne, weapons that exist at the intersection of the material and immaterial. And they are driven by Khorne's own essence in such concentrated form that their existence is a constant act of war. A bloodthirster does not choose to fight. Fighting is what it is. Below them in the demonic hierarchy are the bloodletters, the rank-and-file warriors of Khorne's legions, beings of red flesh and black blades, whose tactical purpose is the destruction of everything in front of them, and the fleshhounds, demonic creatures that hunt psykers with particular ferocity, because psykers represent the magic that Khorne despises. The skull cannons and bloodthirsters that accompany Khorne's demonic legions provide ranged capability that might seem inconsistent with Khorne's disdain for indirect violence, but the lore frames these as expressions of pure destructive force rather than tactical cleverness, weapons that exist to bring enemies into range for the close combat that Khorne actually cares about. Khorne's power in the current era of the setting is enormous. The Great Rift, the massive tear in reality that split the galaxy following the events of the Gathering Storm, has allowed Khorne's influence to flood into the material universe at scales that the Imperium's defenses were not designed to counter. The perpetual warfare that characterizes the 41st millennium feeds him continuously, and his followers on both sides of the conflict, among the traitor legions and among the mortal cultists who have given themselves to his service, represent a military threat that no single imperial force has the capacity to address comprehensively. Khorne's relationship to the other gods is defined by contempt and competition. He will ally tactically but never strategically, and the alliances he forms are always temporary conveniences that he abandons the moment direct conflict becomes advantageous. His particular hatred for Tzeentch is reciprocated, and the two gods have fought proxy wars through their respective cults and demonic forces more consistently than any other pairing in the Great Game. Tzeentch, the Changer of Ways. Tzeentch is the most difficult of the four Chaos gods to understand, and this difficulty is not incidental. It is the point. He is the god of change, of hope, of ambition, of the particular psychic energy that planning and scheming and the desire for a different future produce in minds that have the capacity for complex thought. He is also the god of magic, of mutation, of the manipulation of fate, of the specific pleasure that comes from knowing things others do not, and from arranging events to produce outcomes that only you saw coming. He is depicted as a constantly shifting figure whose form never quite resolves into anything stable, whose features change as you look at them, whose laughter is the sound of 1,000 voices that do not agree on what they find funny. His symbol is the three-pointed arrow, suggesting change in multiple directions simultaneously. His sacred colors are blue and gold and pink. His sacred number is 9. Tzeentch's power comes from a source that is both more and less accessible than Khorne's. Every mortal who hopes for a better future, who plans for something they do not yet have, who seeks knowledge or power through study and scheming rather than direct force, feeds Tzeentch. This makes his potential worshipper pool enormous, encompassing every ambitious scholar, every political schemer, Every psyker who draws on the warp's energies without fully understanding what that act of drawing feeds. It also makes his relationship with his followers more complex than Khorne's, because Tzeentch genuinely values intelligence and subtlety in those who serve him. And he expresses this valuation by making his service an endless labyrinth of tests and betrayals and revelations that leave his followers perpetually uncertain whether they are serving him or being served up by him. The central paradox of Tzeentch's theology is the paradox of change itself. He desires change above all things, but if change were ever complete, if everything had become something else, there would be nothing left to change, and Tzeentch would cease to have a purpose. He therefore has an interest in perpetuating the conditions that produce change, rather than in achieving any particular changed state. His plans are not directed toward specific outcomes so much as they are directed toward the maintenance of a universe in which plans remain possible, in which the future is always different from the present, in which nothing is ever settled and everything is always in motion. This has produced the theological position sometimes called the paradox of Tzeentch, which holds that Tzeentch actually works against the ultimate victory of chaos as often as he works for it, because a universe in which chaos has won is a universe in which the conditions for change have been permanently resolved in one direction, and that resolution is antithetical to his nature. Some scholars of the Inquisition's Ordo Malleus have found this paradox to be one of the more useful tools for understanding why chaos has not simply overwhelmed the material universe despite its advantages, arguing that Tzeentch's active interest in maintaining the contest is a structural check on his brother's more straightforwardly destructive ambitions. Whether Tzeentch finds this analysis amusing, infuriating, or irrelevant is not information he has chosen to provide. This makes him a deeply unreliable patron. His followers receive power and knowledge and the specific gifts of mutation that his favor confers, but they receive these things within schemes that they cannot see the full shape of, and the full shape, if Tzeentch has one, may not actually favor the individual follower's survival or success. Many of his most devoted servants have been sacrificed to serve a larger purpose that Tzeentch found more interesting than their continued existence. He is not cruel in the way Khorne is cruel. He is simply indifferent to the specific fates of individuals in a way that makes him dangerous to follow. The Thousand Sons Traitor Legion and their Primarch Magnus the Red are the most significant mortal servants of Tzeentch in the current setting era. Magnus was a psyker of extraordinary power who turned to Tzeentch partly in desperation, seeking the god's protection against the flesh change that was corrupting his legion's gene seed, and found that the protection came at a cost that transformed his legion into something they had not agreed to become. The Thousand Sons are now mostly rubric marines, warriors whose souls have been trapped inside their armor by the rubric of Ahriman, suits of power armor that move with purpose but contain nothing living. Their sorcerers, who retained their minds and their power, walk among these hollow warriors as both commanders and custodians, guiding the animated shells that were once their brothers. Ahriman himself, the chief librarian of the Thousand Sons who cast the rubric, is one of the setting's most complex figures. He cast the rubric to save his brothers from the flesh change, a magical working of such ambition and complexity that it required him to draw on Tzeentch's power in ways that he did not fully control. The result saved the sorcerers and damned the rest of the Legion to their hollow existence, and Ahriman has spent 10,000 years in a quest to reverse this outcome, seeking the means to restore his brothers. Consulting texts and artifacts and beings of power across the galaxy in a search that Tzeentch has observed with what the lore implies is enormous satisfaction. Ahriman is Tzeentch's perfect servant, precisely because he never stops seeking, never stops changing his approach, never accepts that the situation is permanent. He is the embodiment of his patron's nature in a mortal form. Tzeentch's daemons reflect his nature in ways that Khorne's do not. Where Khorne's daemons are straightforwardly martial, Tzeentch's are expressions of change and unreality. The Lords of Change are his greatest servants, enormous avian creatures of vast intelligence and magical power who function as Tzeentch's eyes and agents in the material world, pursuing his incomprehensible schemes with the patience of beings who have been doing this for longer than most civilizations have existed. The Horrors, pink and blue, are his rank-and-file daemons, creatures of pure chaotic magic that split into smaller versions when destroyed, making them frustrating to fight and emblematic of the multiplication of change that defines their patron. A pink horror destroyed becomes two blue horrors, and the blue horrors destroyed become brimstone horrors. Smaller still, each division a miniature expression of Tzeentch's obsession with multiplication and transformation. The Flamers of Tzeentch channel his mutagenic fire, burning with flames that alter what they touch rather than simply consuming it. And the Screamers of Tzeentch move through the warp and the material world alike with a speed that makes them effective hunters of psychers and isolated units. His relationship with Nurgle is the most consistently antagonistic of the four pairings after Khorne and Tzeentch. Nurgle represents stasis and acceptance, the persistence of things as they are, rather than their transformation into something else. This is the philosophical opposite of Tzeentch's core nature, and the two gods have maintained a rivalry that goes deeper than competition for psychic resources into something that resembles genuine ideological conflict. Nurgle, the Lord of All. Nurgle is the most misunderstood of the four Chaos gods, not because he is complex in the way Tzeentch is complex, but because the revulsion he produces in those who first encounter his domain prevents them from understanding what he actually represents. He is the god of disease and decay, of death and the rebirth that follows death, of the terrible generosity of a being who gives gifts that cannot be refused. He is also, in the deepest and most uncomfortable reading of his nature, the god of love. He is depicted as an enormous, bloated figure of jovial malevolence, his body a catalogue of every disease and rot and infestation that has ever afflicted living flesh, his face set in a permanent expression of paternal delight at the suffering of his children. He laughs constantly, a deep and genuine laugh that comes from a place of complete satisfaction with the universe as it is. His sacred colors are green and brown. His sacred number is 7. The love reading requires some unpacking because it is not immediately apparent in a being whose gifts include plague and corruption and the festering wounds that his followers display with pride. But Nurgle's relationship to his followers is genuinely parental in its emotional content. He loves them. He gives them gifts, the gifts of disease that alter the body in ways that eventually provide a horrifying resilience, the gifts of decay that make the body permeable to the warp in ways that increase psychic sensitivity, the gifts of Nurgle's rot that bind followers to each other and to him in a community of shared suffering. These gifts are terrible. They are also freely given, and the giving comes from a place of genuine care for the follower's spiritual condition, if not their physical one. Nurgle's power comes from a different source than the other gods' power. Khorne feeds on violence, Tzeentch feeds on ambition, Slaanesh feeds on sensation. Nurgle feeds on despair, on the particular psychic state that comes from confronting mortality without the resources to face it, and on the relief that comes when acceptance replaces that despair. Every mortal who has ever been too sick to fight their condition, who has given up resistance and simply allowed the disease to take its course, has in some small way fed Nurgle. Every civilization that has confronted plague and found its institutions inadequate and its people broken has fed him enormously. His garden of Nurgle, sometimes called the Grandfather's Garden, is his domain in the warp, and it is described in the lore with a specificity that makes it one of the more fully realized of the Chaos God domains. It is a vast landscape of rot and bloom, of things dying and things growing from the decay of what died before them, an environment in which the cycle of life and death operates at maximum speed and maximum visibility. New diseases are cultivated here. New gifts are developed. The garden is tended by Nurgle himself, with the absorbed contentment of a being who finds genuine meaning in the act of creation, even when what is being created will cause immeasurable suffering. The Death Guard Traitor Legion and their Primarch Mortarion are Nurgle's most significant mortal servants, and their corruption is one of the more fully documented transformations in the Heresy-era lore. Mortarion was a warrior who despised psychers and sorcery above almost anything, who had built his entire identity around physical toughness and the endurance of terrible conditions without supernatural aid, and who was broken by the demonic plague that the forces of chaos deliberately exposed his legion to in the warp. When the plague proved too much even for the Death Guard's legendary endurance, Mortarion called on Nurgle in desperation. And Nurgle answered, and the answer transformed the entire legion into the walking plague-bearers they remain in the current setting. The Death Guard are now essentially plague delivery systems of extraordinary resilience. Their bodies are bloated and rotting, hosting colonies of disease and infestation that would have killed them 1,000 times over if Nurgle's gifts had not transformed their biology into something that can accommodate and even draw strength from conditions that should be fatal. They feel no pain in the conventional sense. Their armor and their flesh have merged over 10,000 years into something that is neither quite mechanical nor quite biological. A hybrid of the two that is slower than a standard space marine, but vastly more difficult to stop. They spread Nurgle's gifts to everything they encounter, their very presence corrupting the environments they occupy, their weapons carrying plagues that linger long after the warriors themselves have moved on. Mortarion himself is a daemon prince of extraordinary power, transformed beyond anything human or even Primarch by 10,000 years of Nurgle's favor. He commands the Death Guard from the Plague Planet, a world within the Eye of Terror that has become a garden of Nurgle's making, an environment of rot and bloom that mirrors on a planetary scale the aesthetic of Nurgle's own domain in the warp. The Great Unclean Ones are Nurgle's greatest daemons, vast and jovial and revolting, entities that carry within their bloated bodies the full catalogue of Nurgle's diseases, and that spread his gifts simply by existing in proximity to things that can be infected. Each Great Unclean One is in some sense a direct manifestation of Nurgle himself, carrying something of the god's own essence, in a way that makes them simultaneously his most powerful representatives and the most direct expression of what he is. The Plague-Bearers are his rank-and-file servants, morose and methodical, tallying the diseases they carry with the dedication of accountants committed to accuracy, a counterpoint to Nurgle's own exuberance that some theological traditions interpret as a deliberate expression of the god's sense of humor. The Nurglings, small and mischievous manifestations of his essence, are perhaps the most unsettling of his demonic servants, precisely because they are genuinely playful and apparently joyful about their role in spreading decay, their cheerfulness in the context of corruption being one of the setting's more effective expressions of cosmic horror through tonal dissonance. Nurgle's relationship to Tzeentch has already been discussed, but his relationship to the other gods is worth examining. He and Khorne have a relationship of mutual disinterest more than hostility, their domains not directly conflicting in the way that change and decay conflict, though they compete for the same pool of psychic energy that all mortal suffering provides. His relationship with Slaanesh is complex, the excess and sensation that Slaanesh represents being antithetical to Nurgle's philosophy of acceptance, but the two have allied more often than any other pairing in the Great Game, drawn together by a shared interest in the corruption of mortal flesh, even if the direction of that corruption differs. Slaanesh, the Dark Prince. Slaanesh is the youngest of the four Chaos Gods and the most personal in the specific nature of the threat they represent. The others emerged gradually from the accumulated psychic output of the galaxy's mortal minds over millions of years. Slaanesh was born in a single catastrophic moment, the birth scream of a god whose arrival tore a hole in the warp that has never fully healed, and who came into existence already hungry, already consuming, already reaching for more. The pronoun question around Slaanesh is worth addressing directly. The lore consistently presents Slaanesh as androgynous, a deity of absolute sensory experience, who transcends the categories of gender in the same way they transcend all other categories of limitation. They are depicted as divinely beautiful in a way that mortal minds cannot fully process without distortion. Their physical appearance the literal embodiment of desire itself. Their features different for every observer depending on what that observer most wants to see. Slaanesh represents sensation taken to its logical extreme, the relentless pursuit of experience beyond what is sustainable or survivable, the specific psychic state that comes from pushing sensation to the point where the distinction between pleasure and pain dissolves and only intensity remains. They are the god of excess in the most complete sense, encompassing not only physical sensation, but the sensory excess of art and music and perfection-seeking, the obsessive pursuit of mastery that eventually hollows out the person pursuing it, the addiction to any experience that provides enough intensity to justify the cost of seeking it. The fall of the Eldar is Slaanesh's origin story, and it is one of the most significant events in the Warhammer 40,000 setting's deep history. The Eldar Empire at its height was the most advanced civilization in the galaxy, a culture of such psychic sensitivity and artistic sophistication that its collective inner life was incomparably more vivid and more powerful than that of any other species. This inner life left an enormous presence in the warp, one that grew across thousands of years of Eldar civilization, and that gradually took on a coherence and a direction as the culture's increasing decadence fed it with ever more extreme psychic material. When the Eldar Empire collapsed under the weight of its own excesses, the accumulated psychic energy released in a single moment, and Slaanesh was born. The birth scream destroyed most of the Eldar who were not protected by psychic shielding or physical distance, tore open the Eye of Terror in what had been the heart of Eldar space, and announced the arrival of the fourth Chaos God, with a devastation that reshaped the strategic geography of the galaxy. The surviving Eldar have a relationship to Slaanesh that is unique among mortal species in the setting. The god was born from them. Their souls are Slaanesh's preferred food, and the god hungers for every Eldar who dies, reaching to consume their soul in a way that makes natural death a spiritual catastrophe for the species. The various responses the surviving Eldar factions have developed to this threat, the spirit stones of the craft-world Eldar that capture souls and prevent their consumption, the deliberate self-corruption of the Drukhari who sate Slaanesh with others' suffering to keep the hunger at bay, the devotion of the Harlequins to Segurak, the laughing god, who hides souls from Slaanesh's reach, all of these represent ongoing survival strategies against a predator whose hunger for them is existential and eternal. Among mortal humans, Slaanesh's followers pursue sensation with the specific logic that Slaanesh's patronage produces. More is always better. Limits are obstacles to be overcome, and the only honest response to the universe's richness is to consume it as completely as possible. The Emperor's children, Traitor Legion, and their Primarch Fulgrim represent the most significant human servants of Slaanesh in the setting. Fulgrim was the most aesthetically refined of the Primarchs, a perfectionist whose pursuit of excellence in all things was his defining characteristic and his greatest vulnerability. The specific form of chaos corruption that Slaanesh arranged for him exploited this perfectly, turning the pursuit of perfection into something that had no natural stopping point and that eventually required experiences of increasing extremity to maintain the sensation of progress. The fall of Fulgrim is documented extensively in the Horus Heresy novel series and is one of the most psychologically detailed corruption narratives in the setting. He did not simply choose chaos. He was seduced into it by a daemon sword that had been waiting for exactly the kind of mind that Fulgrim represented. a sword that whispered to him of perfection that could only be achieved through experience that his original ethical framework would have prohibited. The whispers were patient. They were calibrated to his specific weaknesses, to the perfectionism and the aesthetic sensitivity and the intense personal pride that made him who he was. By the time Fulgrim understood what had happened, he had already done things that closed off every path back to what he had been, and the closing of those paths was itself Slaanesh's work. The Emperor's children in the current era are perhaps the most disturbing of the traitor legions, precisely because they are the most refined, the most deliberately artistic in their violence, the most committed to the philosophical framework that makes what they do internally coherent. They are not simply psychopaths in armor. They are beings who have developed a complete aesthetic of sensation, who regard suffering and pleasure as two expressions of the same fundamental experience, and who pursue both with the same disciplined excellence that Fulgrim brought to all his endeavors before his fall. They are horrifying in a way that simple brutality is not, because what they do has been thought through. The Keeper of Secrets is Slaanesh's greatest demonic servant type, lithe and terrible and beautiful in the way that Slaanesh's gifts are always beautiful, their appearance calibrated to produce the maximum disorientation in whoever encounters them. Each Keeper of Secrets is an individual of considerable personality and specific appetites, their desires as refined as everything else associated with their patron, and their presence on a battlefield is not simply a tactical threat, but a psychic one. Their aura of desire and sensation affecting the minds of everyone nearby in ways that can break concentration and disrupt coordination. The Daemonettes are the rank and file of Slaanesh's forces, fast and lethal and unsettling. Their physical form, the expression of desire made dangerous, their claws capable of cutting through armor and spirit alike. The Fiends of Slaanesh and the Steeds of Slaanesh round out the daemonic catalogue, creatures that embody different aspects of sensation and pursuit. Slaanesh's power in the current era is substantial, but differently distributed than the other gods' power. The Great Rift has increased all four gods' influence in the material universe, but Slaanesh's particular growth has been fueled by the specific despair and hedonism that the 41st millennium's darkness produces in those who choose to look away from the horror by immersing themselves in experience. Every mortal who seeks oblivion in sensation, who chooses not to feel the horror of their situation by feeling something else more intensely, feeds Slaanesh a little. In a galaxy defined by the specific horrors of the 41st millennium, this is an enormous and continuously replenished food source. The daemonic hierarchy. The Chaos Gods do not act in the material universe only through their mortal followers. They project their power through daemons, immaterial entities that are formed from the warp's psychic substance and shaped by the nature of whichever god they serve. Understanding the daemonic hierarchy is necessary for understanding how chaos operates as a military and spiritual force. Daemons are not independent beings in the way that mortal creatures are independent. They are extensions of their patron's will and nature, given individual form and a degree of autonomous motivation, but fundamentally constituted from the same psychic material as the god they serve. A bloodthirster is a concentrated expression of Khorne's rage. A Lord of Change is a fragment of Tzeentch's scheming intelligence. When a daemon is destroyed in the material universe, it does not die but is banished back to the warp, where it reforms over time and eventually becomes available for deployment again. True death for a daemon requires destruction in the warp itself, which is why daemonic incursions are so difficult to permanently resolve. You cannot kill a bloodthirster. You can only send it home temporarily, and it returns angrier. The conditions required for daemons to manifest in the material universe are a significant limiting factor on their activity, and understanding these conditions helps explain both why demonic incursions are so dangerous and why they are not simply continuous. Daemons require elevated warp energy in the material world to maintain their manifestation, a local thinning of the barrier between the immaterium and real space that can be produced by extreme emotion, large-scale death, psychic activity, or deliberate ritual. The Great Rift's opening has permanently elevated the warp energy in a significant portion of the galaxy, making demonic manifestation easier and more persistent in those regions than it has been since the Heresy era. At the apex of each god's demonic hierarchy stand the greater daemons, beings of enormous power that function as the gods' direct representatives and military commanders. Khorne's bloodthirsters, Tzeentch's lords of change, Nurgle's great unclean ones, and Slaanesh's keepers of secrets are each powerful enough to threaten entire armies and to serve as anchors for demonic incursions that would otherwise disperse without a sufficiently strong psychic presence to maintain the conditions necessary for daemons to remain manifest. A greater daemon's presence on a battlefield changes the fundamental parameters of the engagement, not merely adding a powerful individual combatant, but altering the psychic environment in ways that disadvantage non-chaos forces and enable further demonic manifestation. Below the greater daemons are the lesser daemons, the bloodletters and plague-bearers and horrors and daemonettes that constitute the bulk of any demonic military force. They are individually powerful by the standards of mortal soldiers, but not individually decisive, their effectiveness coming from numbers and the specific tactical capabilities that their nature provides. A single bloodletter will defeat most mortal soldiers. 100 bloodletters will defeat most non-Space Marine military units. 1,000 bloodletters with a bloodthirster anchoring their manifestation represent a threat that requires significant Imperial military resources to address. The Daemon Princes occupy a special category. They are mortals, usually warriors of great power, who have pleased their patron gods sufficiently to be elevated beyond mortality into a permanent state of demonic existence. They retain their intelligence and individuality in a way that lesser daemons do not, which makes them more flexible and more dangerous as commanders and individual combatants. The most famous daemon princes in the setting, figures like Angron of the World Eaters, and Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children and Mortarion of the Death Guard, were once Primarchs, and their elevation to daemonic status represents the transformation of beings who are already among the most powerful warriors in the galaxy into something that operates beyond the boundaries that constrained even a Primarch. They are also in some respects more tragic than either daemons or mortals, having given up the possibility of any future other than endless service to the god who elevated them. The transformation is irreversible. There is no retiring from daemonhood. Daemon engines represent another category of chaos military force, machines that have been infused with daemonic essence to create weapons that combine the destructive capability of war machines with the psychic power of entities from the warp. The Soul Grinder and the Defiler are the most common examples in standard force compositions, but the range of daemon engines that different chaos factions have developed across 10,000 years of innovation represents a significant portion of the military capability that makes chaos forces dangerous in a different register than simple troop quality. A daemon engine does not tire. It does not fear. It does not make tactical errors based on self-preservation instinct. It is a weapon system animated by something that wants to destroy, and it will pursue that desire until it is stopped or until there is nothing left to destroy. The minor powers and the formless wastes. The four major chaos gods are not the only entities of significance in the warp. The Materium is vast, and in its outer reaches, and in the spaces between the gods' territories, other entities exist that have accumulated enough psychic energy to achieve coherent existence without reaching the scale of the major powers. Malal, sometimes called Malice, represents a particularly interesting theological curiosity. He is a chaos god of anti-chaos, a being whose nature is defined by opposition to the other chaos gods and who feeds on the psychic energy of betrayal and self-destruction within chaos itself. His existence is paradoxical by design. a god who exists to destroy the thing he is part of, and his status in the current canonical lore is ambiguous. His original presence in early Warhammer materials having been subject to legal disputes that resulted in his inconsistent treatment across different editions and publications. In the editions where he appears, his followers are those who have been betrayed by chaos, warriors who served the other gods and were discarded or destroyed by them, who found in their rage at that betrayal a new focus that Malal was waiting to receive. He is the revenge of those who chose chaos and found it did not choose them back. And his existence is a reminder that even within the architecture of chaos, there are contradictions that produce new and dangerous forms of power. The Chaos God, known as the Horned Rat, represents a more settled case in a different direction. A deity that is primarily associated with the Skaven in the Warhammer Fantasy Battles setting, but whose influence in the 40k setting is occasionally referenced in materials that bridge the two properties. His status as a full Chaos God, rather than a minor power or a daemon lord, is debated among in-universe theologians who have had access to sufficient information to have such debates, which is a very small number of people. The Inquisition's position is that accurate theological taxonomy of entities, this powerful, is less important than developing reliable methods for opposing them. The formless ones, the entities of the warp that have not achieved the coherent individuality of the major gods or their acknowledged servants, represent a different kind of threat. These are the nameless things that psychers encounter in the warp, the creatures that devour unprotected souls. The predators of the Materium that make navigation without protection a death sentence for those without significant psychic shielding. They are not aligned with any specific god. They simply exist in the way that deep ocean predators exist, opportunistically and without broader motivation than survival and the consumption of the psychic energy that souls and living minds provide. Some of these formless entities are ancient, older than the Chaos Gods themselves, survivors from the earlier warp that predates the condensation of the four major powers. They regard the gods with something that might be wariness, having existed long enough to remember a warp in which the gods did not dominate everything. The Chaos Undivided theological position, followed by many of the traitor legions and mortal chaos forces who do not pledge themselves specifically to one of the four, treats all four chaos gods as expressions of a single underlying chaos power rather than as distinct and competing entities. This position is theologically convenient for military forces that want access to the full range of chaos's gifts without the specific demands and limitations that individual god allegiance imposes. And it has the additional advantage of not requiring the follower to navigate the political complexities of inter-god competition. Whether it is theologically accurate is a question the gods themselves have never answered definitively, which may itself be the answer. Tzeentch in particular has been observed to find the question amusing, which Tzeentch scholars interpret as either a confirmation, a denial, or a third thing that is neither of those and that requires further study. The Neverborn is a term sometimes used to describe daemons collectively, emphasizing their nature as beings that exist outside the normal cycle of birth and death that mortal creatures inhabit. It is a term that carries theological weight in some chaos traditions, framing daemons not as lesser beings than mortals but as more fundamental ones, entities that predate the material universe's current form and that will persist after it ends. The term is rejected by the Imperium's official theological position, which classifies all warp entities as abominations rather than as a category of being with its own legitimacy. The Chaos Gods, predictably, have no opinion on the Imperium's classification systems. The Great Game and its consequences. The Great Game is the permanent competition between the four Chaos Gods for dominance of the warp and supremacy over the material universe, and it is the most important political fact about chaos as a force in the setting. It determines why chaos, despite its enormous power, has not simply overwhelmed the material universe. The gods are more interested in competing with each other than in cooperating against external targets, and the mortal races of the galaxy have survived partly because the gods' attention is divided. The Great Game operates at multiple levels simultaneously. In the Warp, the gods' demonic legions fight constantly for territory and prestige, battles that reshape the Materium's psychic landscape without ever producing permanent results, because no victory in the Warp is ever permanent. The territories that each god controls within the Warp reflect their relative power at any given moment, expanding when their mortal following is strong and their demonic forces have momentum, contracting when their brothers press them back. These territorial shifts have no direct effect on the material universe, but they indicate the current state of the balance of power and can predict which god's followers are likely to be most active in the material world in the near term. In the material universe, the gods pursue their competition through their mortal followers, the traitor legions and the mortal cults, and the demon princes who serve them, and through the specific interventions they make in events they consider worth shaping. A Chaos warband that carries the mark of Khorne encountering a Chaos warband that carries the mark of Tzeentch is as likely to fight as to cooperate, and this tendency toward internecine conflict is one of the defining features of Chaos military operations from the perspective of their opponents. An Imperial commander who understands this can sometimes exploit it deliberately, positioning forces in ways that bring different Chaos factions into conflict with each other rather than with the Imperial defenders. Alliances within the Great Game are temporary by definition. The most stable pairing historically has been Nurgle and Slaanesh, who share an interest in the corruption of mortal flesh, and who have cooperated often enough that their alliance has a name in some theological traditions. Khorne and Tzeentch maintain the most consistent enmity, their natures so fundamentally opposed that cooperation between them is almost never observed. Other alliances form and dissolve based on the specific circumstances of the game in any given period, and the mortals who serve as the instruments of these alliances are rarely informed when the political situation between their patrons has shifted. The implications of the Great Game for the mortal races are both direct and indirect. Directly, it means that Chaos military forces rarely achieve the unified coordination that would make them invincible, their internal competition undermining strategic coherence at exactly the moments when sustained pressure might achieve decisive results. Indirectly, it means that the Warp itself is shaped by the competition, that the currents and storms of the Materium reflect the gods' ongoing conflict in ways that affect every being who travels through it or draws on its energies. The Great Rift's opening has changed the balance of the Great Game in ways that are still unfolding in the setting's current narrative. The Warp's direct connection to the material universe across the Rift's entire length has given all four gods expanded access to mortal prey, and has reduced the material costs of demonic incursion to the point where the scale of Chaos's military pressure on the mortal races has increased dramatically. Whether this represents a phase shift in the Great Game toward eventual Chaos dominance, or simply an escalation that will be followed by some form of equilibrium, is a question the setting has not yet answered. Worship, corruption, and the marks of Chaos. The relationship between the Chaos gods and their mortal followers is not simply one of power exchanged for service. It is a relationship of transformation, and understanding the stages of that transformation illuminates how Chaos expands its influence in the material universe. The initial contact between a mortal and a Chaos god is rarely a conscious theological decision. It is more often a moment of extremity in which the mortal reaches for something beyond ordinary capability and finds that the Warp is responsive to the reaching. A warrior overwhelmed in combat who calls on something, anything, for the strength to survive. A scholar whose legitimate research touches the edges of forbidden knowledge and who finds that the knowledge responds to being touched. A person whose despair has reached the point where any relief, even terrible relief, is preferable to continuing as they are. These are the entry points, and they are as various as the extremities that produce them. What makes this mechanism so effective and so difficult for the Imperium and other civilizations to counter comprehensively is that the first contact typically feels like the mortal's own choice. They reached for power. Power responded. The god did not compel them. The god simply made itself available to the reaching, which is a very different relationship from the coercive one that most people imagine when they think about corruption. The coercion comes later, after the first gifts have been accepted and the first marks have appeared, when the relationship has developed enough that the followers' options have been reduced by the accumulation of their own choices. The mark of chaos is the physical expression of a god's attention, a brand or mutation that appears on the body of a follower who has attracted sufficient divine notice. Each god's mark has specific properties. Khorne's mark enhances combat capability and the physical expression of rage. Tzeentch's mark increases psychic sensitivity and the capacity for magical manipulation. Nurgle's mark provides resistance to disease and pain through the specific corruptions of the body that his gifts entail. Slaanesh's mark heightens sensory acuity and the capacity for sensation in both directions. The marks are visible to other Chaos followers, creating a social dimension to Chaos worship that operates as a recognition system and a status marker within the cults and warbands that make up Chaos's mortal following. The Chaos gifts that follow the mark are more extensive physical transformations, mutations that are genuinely useful in the short term and genuinely horrifying in their implications. Extra eyes that see in spectrums unavailable to normal human perception. Limbs that have been replaced by something more functional for violence. Skin that has toughened beyond what flesh should be capable of. These gifts accumulate, and their accumulation moves the follower progressively further from their original human form. The endpoint of this accumulation is either apotheosis, elevation to Daemon Prince status that preserves the individual's intelligence and personality within a daemonic form, or spawnhood, the transformation into a chaos spawn, a creature of mindless mutation that retains nothing of the person who existed before the gifts overwhelmed their ability to maintain coherent form. Apotheosis is the god's reward for exceptional service. Spawnhood is the fate of those who accumulated gifts without the will or capability to use them effectively, whose bodies changed faster than their minds could adapt. The distinction between the two outcomes is not entirely within the follower's control, which is one of the things that makes Chaos patronage so specifically horrifying as a theological proposition. You can pursue apotheosis and receive spawnhood. You can serve with genuine effectiveness and still find that the god's judgment of what you deserve differs from your own. The gods do not make promises about outcomes. They make offers of power, and what the power eventually produces is the gods to determine. The Chaos spawn that shamble at the edges of Chaos warbands, mindless and horrifying, were once warriors who believed they were on the path to something better. Their presence is intended as a reminder and a warning. In practice, it functions as neither, because the warriors who see them have already accepted the terms of the relationship and have no interest in revisiting that acceptance. Chaos in the 41st millennium. The four Chaos gods' presence in the 41st millennium is at its most powerful since the Horus heresy, and the specific conditions of that era have created opportunities for Chaos influence that did not exist before. The Great Rift is the most significant change. The galaxy-spanning tear in reality that opened following the fall of Cadia and the ritual of the Gathering Storm has divided the Imperium physically and spiritually, cutting off vast swathes of Imperial territory from the light of the Astronomicon, enabling demonic incursions at scales that were previously rare, and providing a direct conduit from the warp to the material universe along its entire length. Every Chaos god benefits from this, but the specific nature of the benefit varies with their domains. Khorne benefits from the increased warfare that the disruption has produced. Tzeentch benefits from the uncertainty and the proliferation of desperate schemes that characterize an Imperium suddenly cut in two. Nurgle benefits from the plagues that follow in the wake of disrupted supply lines and collapsed population centers. Slaanesh benefits from the despair that makes sensation-seeking an increasingly attractive alternative to confronting the situation. The traitor legions, the 9 Space Marine legions that turned against the Emperor during the Horus Heresy and have fought against the Imperium for 10,000 years from their bases in the Eye of Terror and now the Warp at large, represent the most organized and militarily capable mortal servants of chaos. Each of the major legions is associated primarily with one of the 4 gods, though allegiances have shifted and fractured over 10 millennia of independent operation. The World Eaters for Khorne, the Thousand Sons for Tzeentch, the Death Guard for Nurgle, the Emperor's Children for Slaanesh. The Black Legion, formerly the Sons of Horus, maintain the Chaos Undivided position and serve as the closest thing to a unified Chaos military force that the current era produces. Their Warmaster Abaddon, the Despoiler, the successor to Horus's position, if not his genetic line, has launched 13 Black Crusades from the Eye of Terror over the millennia, each one a significant military operation, and the most recent of which succeeded in destroying Cadia and opening the Rift. The mortal cults that operate within Imperial space, the networks of Chaos worshippers who maintain their practices in secret within the Imperium's civilian population, represent a different kind of threat than the traitor legions. They are the mechanism by which Chaos maintains a presence in the material universe, even in regions where no demonic incursion has occurred. The seeds of future rebellions and corruption that the Inquisition exists partly to identify and destroy before they can flower. The Inquisition's Ordo Hereticus specializes in identifying these internal threats and the scale of their work, the number of investigations, purges, and trials that they conduct across the Imperium in any given year provides an indirect measure of how deeply chaos has penetrated Imperial society. The relationship between chaos and the other major threats facing the Imperium is complex. The Tyranids, whose approach from beyond the galaxy represents the most existential biological threat in the setting, are actually a partial check on chaos, because the hive mind's consumption of psychic biomass reduces the warp's activity in regions it passes through. The shadow in the warp that the hive fleet projects actually suppressing the demonic activity that would otherwise flourish. The Necrons, ancient and anti-psychic by nature, represent a technological civilizational threat that is also partially antithetical to chaos, their warriors, resistance to psychic influence, making them difficult targets for chaos corruption. The Orcs feed Khorne, but not the other gods particularly, their psychic gestalt producing exactly the kind of mindless violence that Khorne most enjoys without producing the subtler psychic outputs that the other gods feed on. The Imperium's response to chaos is defined by the same paradox that has always characterized that relationship. To fight chaos effectively requires understanding it, and understanding it risks corruption. The Inquisition's various factions, particularly the Ordo Malleus, which specializes in demonic threats, have developed techniques for studying and combating chaos that walk the line between necessary knowledge and dangerous proximity. The Grey Knights, a secret chapter of Space Marines whose entire existence is dedicated to anti-demonic warfare, and whose gene seed has been specifically designed to resist chaos corruption, represent the Imperium's most specialized tool against the demonic threat. Their existence is known to almost no one within the Imperium, their operations covered by the Inquisition's authority and the Administratum's deliberately obscured records, because the knowledge that such a chapter exists raises questions about the nature of the threat it was created to counter, that the Imperium's leadership has judged are better left unasked by the general population. The Chaos Gods are not going to be defeated. This is one of the setting's fundamental premises, and it is worth stating clearly. They cannot be killed in any conventional sense because they are not alive in any conventional sense. They are the psychic residue of mortal experience made autonomous, and as long as mortal beings experience rage and hope and despair and desire, Khorne and Tzeentch and Nurgle and Slaanesh will exist and will be powerful. The most the Imperium and the other mortal races can hope for is survival. The maintenance of enough order and enough resistance that the Chaos Gods' perpetual hunger is not satisfied quickly enough to reach the threshold that would represent true and final victory. The gods do not need that victory quickly. They have been waiting since before the first human civilization rose from the dust of a cooling world. They will wait as long as necessary. They are fed by the waiting as much as by anything else, by the hope and the despair and the rage and the hunger of every mortal being who has ever looked at the darkness and asked what is out there. Something answered. It is still answering. It will always be answering. That is what it means to live in the 41st millennium. That is what it means to live in a universe where the gods of chaos are real and hungry and patient and made entirely of what you feel when you are afraid.